Welcome to today's deep dive. We're really thrilled to have you joining us.
Yeah.
I want to start by painting a picture, and I want you to place yourself directly inside this scenario.
Okay, let's set the scene.
Right. So it's a Saturday evening, you're sitting at a dinner party, or maybe you're squeezed into a booth at a brunch spot.
One of those places you've been going to for, the better part of a decade.
Exactly. And you are surrounded by people you consider your closest friends. These are the individuals you have history with.
The ones who are there for the terrible haircuts.
The questionable career choices, the bad breakups, all the milestones. On paper, they know you better than anyone else in the world.
Yeah.
But as you sit there sipping your coffee or your wine, something kind of strange happens.
You start to detach a little bit.
Right. You look around the table, you listen to the cadence of the conversation, the familiar complaints about a boss, the same recycled gossip about a mutual acquaintance, the predictable debates, and you suddenly realize that the entire exchange feels like static.
Just background noise.
Yes, just background noise. And it's not that these people are malicious or intentionally exclusionary.
And it's not even that they're inherently boring.
No, not at all. Yet you find yourself subtly checking your watch under the table. You're mentally calculating how much longer you have to stay before it becomes socially acceptable to claim you have an early morning and make your exit.
The classic Irish goodbye prep.
Right. And as you sit there, smiling and nodding on autopilot, this very quiet, deeply uncomfortable question creeps into your mind. When exactly did this stop being fun?
That is, wow. That hits hard.
It does. You start realizing that you're craving something entirely different. You long for quieter moments, interactions that require you to actually think.
Conversations that stretch your perspective rather than just reinforcing old narratives.
Exactly. So if you have ever felt that subtle, almost guilt-inducing disconnect from a social circle you once fundamentally cherished, you need to know that you're not alone. And more importantly, you are not imagining it.
No, you're really not. That scenario is viscerally familiar to almost anyone who is committed to any form of long-term personal development. It perfectly encapsulates the core tension we're tackling today.
And to pull this apart, we have assembled a pretty massive stack of sources today.
We really have. We're looking at this phenomenon from multiple overlapping disciplines.
Yeah, we've got an incredibly nuanced academic model from Science Direct. It explores the specific mechanisms of how adult friendships dissolve.
Which, surprisingly, is a shockingly under-researched area of sociology.
It really is. And we're layering that with psychological frameworks from Psychology Today and Discover Magazine. Looking closely at behavioral economics concepts like sunk costs and what the literature calls feudal persistence.
And we're also pulling heavily from the neuroscience of habit formation. We'll be referencing Charles Duhigg's extensive work on behavioral loops, alongside some fascinating neuroplasticity research highlighted in the Soulful Psych.
Plus, to ground all this theory, we're incorporating practical, lived experience perspectives from the Vessel, Headspace, and the PBT Institute.
It is a massive stack of material. It spans everything from brain chemistry to behavioral economics. But the mission for this deep dive is actually very singular.
What's the mission?
What we are setting out to do today is unpack the hidden mechanics of personal growth. We want to look at the cold, hard science of why evolving as a person inevitably, almost predictably, creates severe friction with your existing social circles.
Friction is definitely the right word.
It is. And ultimately, we are going to explore how to navigate the deeply uncomfortable process of outgrowing your old life without inadvertently sabotaging the new one you are trying to build.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we're going to understand why our relationships fracture when we change, we have to start with the mechanics of why we change in the first place.
Or, more accurately, why we find it so incredibly difficult to maintain that change.
Right. And that brings us to the bedrock of human behavior, which is habits. Now, we're all generally familiar with Charles Duhigg's framework from The Power of Habit.
The basic three-part loop.
Yes, the cue, the routine, and the reward. That's baseline knowledge for anyone into this topic. But what the source material points out is that knowing the loop isn't enough to change the behavior.
Because there's an invisible engine driving that entire cycle.
And what is that engine?
Craving. The loop itself is just a mechanism. The cue triggers the routine, which delivers the reward. But over time, the brain begins to anticipate the reward the moment the cue appears.
So the anticipation itself becomes a neurological craving.
Exactly. And the sources highlight a brilliant historical case study to illustrate how powerful and blind this craving can be. It's the development of Procter & Gamble's Febreze.
Oh, I love this story.
It's so good. When P&G first formulated Febreze, they had a technological marvel on their hands. It didn't just mask odors, it chemically deactivated them.
Right, so they launched it with a marketing campaign focused entirely on destroying bad smells.
Targeting people with smelly homes, pet owners, people who smoked indoors.
And the product completely failed.
Massive flop. Total failure.
I always find this part of the story fascinating because the logic seems so sound. I mean, if someone's house smells terrible, they should be the ultimate consumer for an odor eliminator. Why did it fail?
Well, the researchers actually went into the field to figure this out. They visited the home of a woman who owned 9 cats.
9 cats. So the house was...
Predictably, overwhelmingly pungent. But when they asked her what she did about the smell, she replied that it wasn't a problem. She couldn't smell it.
Wow.
It's olfactory adaptation. If you live in a smelly environment, your brain eventually tunes it out to prevent sensory overload. So in the context of the habit loop, there was no cue.
Because she couldn't smell the cats, there was no trigger to prompt the routine of spraying the Febreze.
And therefore no craving for the reward of a clean-smelling house. The product only became a billion-dollar juggernaut when P&G stopped trying to create a new habit loop.
They hijacked an existing one instead.
Exactly. They rebranded Febreze not as an odor eliminator, but as the final, satisfying reward at the end of a cleaning routine.
You vacuum, you dust, you make the bed.
And then the reward, you spray Febreze to give the room that final sensory finishing touch. They tapped into the craving for a tangible reward after the exertion of cleaning.
So our behaviors are essentially hijacked by these underlying cravings, often without our conscious consent. But if we know how the mechanism works, why is it so exhausting to implement a new behavior?
That's where the soulful psych piece comes in. It dives into the science of neuroplasticity.
Right. And we've largely moved past the myth that you can't teach an old dog new tricks. You, the listener, know the brain remains plastic. We know it generates new neural pathways until the end of our lives.
But knowing it's possible doesn't explain why it feels like moving mountains. To understand the exhaustion, we have to look at the physical reality of how these pathways are formed and utilized.
The physical infrastructure of the brain.
Yes. When brain cells communicate frequently, when you repeat a habit, a thought pattern, or a reaction, the connection between those specific neurons strengthens.
The myelin sheath coating the neural pathway becomes thicker.
Which allows electrical signals to travel faster and with less energy expenditure.
And the analogy presented in the research is incredibly helpful for visualizing this. Think of these neural pathways as actual roads in your brain.
Your oldest, most deeply ingrained habits.
The way you react to criticism, the food you reach for when you're tired, the conversational dynamics you fall into with your oldest friends.
Those are motorways.
Exactly. Massive, multi-lane, freshly paved highways. Electrical signals can travel down them at top speed with absolute efficiency and almost zero energy cost.
But when you decide to embark on a journey of personal growth, you are opting out of the motorway.
You decide you're going to stop engaging in toxic gossip, or you're going to start setting rigid boundaries with a demanding family member.
And that new behavior does not have a paved highway. It is a bush track.
A densely overgrown, unpaved path in the wilderness of your brain.
Navigating it requires you to mentally hack your way through the underbrush with a machete. It demands intense focus, massive amounts of glucose, and constant conscious effort.
And that energy demand is where the system usually breaks down, which leads us to what the research terms the stress trap.
Right. The human brain is an energy conservation machine. Its primary evolutionary mandate is to keep you alive while burning the least amount of energy possible.
So when you are under stress, a looming deadline at work, a fight with your spouse, or simply a lack of sleep, your brain detects a threat to its resources.
So let's say you've been diligently walking that new bush track for a week. You are committed to your new communication style.
But on Thursday, you get a terrifying email from your boss, and you get a flat tire on the way home.
Your brain's stress alarms go off. In that moment of depletion, your brain is not going to allocate its precious remaining energy to hacking through the bush track.
It immediately reroutes you to the motorway.
It defaults to the most efficient, deeply paved pathway available to alleviate the stress.
You snap at your partner, you pour the massive glass of wine, you engage in the old behavior. It's a profound shift in perspective, honestly.
It really is. It reframes a relapse into old behavior, not as a moral failing or a lack of willpower, but as an elegant, albeit frustrating, biological energy conservation strategy.
But that brings up a much more difficult question, and it's one that Noam Spencer dissects in his piece for Psychology Today. I can understand falling back on an old habit because I'm tired.
Right.
But why do we actively persist in maintaining bad habits or toxic relationships when they are continuously, demonstrably hurting us? Why keep walking down a path that we consciously know leads off a cliff?
Spencer categorizes this phenomenon as futile persistence. It's the human tendency to fiercely maintain routines, rituals, and relationships long after they have ceased to provide any utility.
And even when they generate active harm.
Exactly.
I would challenge that a bit, though. From a biological standpoint, if the brain is an efficiency machine designed for survival, how can clinging to something harmful be categorized as persistence?
You mean, wouldn't the brain quickly register the harm and adapt?
Yeah. The example he uses of eating French fries. I get that it's bad for me in the long run, but in the moment, it achieves the goal of delivering a massive dopamine hit. Is that really futile persistence or just basic gratification?
It's a fair challenge. But Spencer argues that the brain's risk assessment software is fundamentally flawed when dealing with modern timelines.
So?
We are wired to privilege short-term emotional certainty over long-term cerebral probability. When you look at the French fries, the sensory input is immediate. The smell, the salt, the fat, these provide an absolute guaranteed emotional and chemical certainty of pleasure right now.
Whereas the negative consequence, a potential cardiovascular issue decades in the future, is merely a cerebral probability.
Right. It's an abstract concept. It requires immense prefrontal cortex energy to drag that distant abstract probability into the present moment and use it to override a guaranteed immediate reward.
So we're essentially losing a battle between the ancient emotional brain and the modern logical brain.
Yes. But Spencer takes it further. It isn't just about the pursuit of immediate pleasure. It's often about the avoidance of a specific type of pain.
Which he frames as the calculus of fear.
Let's look at the anecdote of the aspiring writer from the source material.
Right, so we have a woman who desperately wants to be a novelist. She talks about being a writer. She buys the expensive notebooks. She sets up the perfect desk.
But she never actually sits down and writes a single page.
Years go by. She's miserable, frustrated, and deeply ashamed of her lack of progress. On the surface, this looks like the ultimate self-sabotage. She's denying herself the one thing she claims will make her happy.
But if we run her behavior through the calculus of fear, a completely different logic emerges. Spencer suggests that her avoidance is not irrational self-sabotage at all.
What is it then?
It's a highly effective, deeply tragic self-protective mechanism.
Because if she sits down to write, she forces a confrontation with her ultimate fear.
The fear that she will pour her soul into a book, put it out into the world, and it will be rejected.
The fear that she will be exposed as untalented, ordinary, and deficient.
That outcome would be psychologically devastating. It is the bigger pain.
So by avoiding the writing, she guarantees that she will feel the daily nagging sting of procrastination.
She accepts the little pain of being stuck.
But in exchange, she successfully protects herself from ever having to face the bigger pain of definitive failure.
Exactly. As long as she doesn't write, she can maintain the fantasy of her unfulfilled potential.
That is a staggering way to look at our own stagnation. It really forces you to audit your own life. You have to ask yourself, what little pain are you willingly enduring every single day just to avoid the potentially bigger pain of the unknown?
Are you staying in a mediocre, unfulfilling relationship, absorbing the little pain of loneliness while sitting right next to someone because you're terrified of the bigger pain of entering the dating pool in your 40s?
Or are you staying in a stagnant career to avoid the terror of testing your skills in the open market?
And this is where the internal landscape collides with the external reality. Because these internal habits, these fear calculations, and these neurological motorways do not exist in a vacuum.
They are in constant dynamic interaction with our environment.
Which brings us to the social trigger.
James Clear, whose work on habits is foundational here, states very simply, environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior.
We have this deeply ingrained cultural myth of the rugged individualist. We like to believe that we are completely independent operators making entirely free, conscious choices based on our internal values.
But the research insists that our environment is continuously, invisibly cueing our behaviors.
And the most potent, influential environment we possess is the people we surround ourselves with.
The research from Headspace isolates a highly specific, universally maddening phenomenon. Imagine you have spent the last 3 years doing intensive personal development work.
You've gone to therapy, you've meditated.
You've broken bad habits, you've developed a calm, measured approach to conflict. You feel like a fundamentally new person.
And then you go home for holiday weekend. or you attend a reunion with your college roommates.
And within 45 minutes, the Zen-like boundary setter is gone.
Vanished. You are suddenly gossiping maliciously, engaging in petty sibling rivalries, or smoking a cigarette on the back porch, just like you did when you were 22.
It is the most defeating feeling in the world. You walk away from those interactions feeling like an absolute fraud.
As if all your personal growth was just a thin veneer that washed off the second you walked through your childhood front door.
Why does the brain do this? Why does it actively abandon the new bush track when we are around people from our past?
It's a matter of evolutionary adaptation. From a survival standpoint, the human animal depends almost entirely on its ability to adapt to its immediate social context.
Because belonging to the tribe was historically a matter of life and death.
Right. When you walk into a room filled with people from your past, those individuals represent a highly specific, deeply familiar environmental context.
Your brain has interacted with your mother or your old college roommate thousands upon thousands of times.
It has recorded massive amounts of data on what behaviors guarantee acceptance in that specific dynamic.
Your brain knows exactly which behavioral motorway to take to ensure that you fit in, that you don't rock the boat, and that your membership in the tribe remains secure.
So reverting to the old you isn't a failure of willpower.
It's a hyper-efficient survival instinct kicking in. The brain says, I know how to survive this room, let me take the wheel.
But it's not just the fear of social rejection that keeps us locked into these old dynamics. It is also tied to how we subconsciously calculate value and loss.
And that leads us to the concept of the sunk cost fallacy, which Discover magazine covers in remarkable depth.
We usually hear about the sunk cost fallacy in business or economics.
Yeah, it's the irrational decision to double down on a terrible investment, like pouring more money into a failing startup or a broken-down car, simply because you have already invested resources that you cannot recover.
But the psychological literature shows that this economic fallacy completely dominates our interpersonal relationships.
The translation of this economic principle into social behavior is fascinating. Christopher Olivala, a researcher at Carnegie Mellon, has spent his career studying this.
He points to a landmark 2018 study out of the University of Minho in Portugal that quantified exactly how much of our lives we are willing to sacrifice at the altar of sunk costs.
The setup of that study is brilliant. The researchers presented over 900 participants with various hypothetical scenarios involving deeply unhappy, fundamentally unfulfilling romantic relationships.
And they manipulated the variables. Some participants were told the relationship was relatively new,
While others were told they had already invested 10 years into the partnership.
and the data they extracted from that study is genuinely alarming.
The researchers found that participants were willing to stay in an explicitly miserable relationship for an average of nearly 300 extra days.
Almost a full calendar year of guaranteed unhappiness.
If they believed they had already invested a decade into it, they were willing to sacrifice their future happiness to honor an unrecoverable past investment.
But Olivala's own experiments reveal an even stranger layer to this. He demonstrated that we don't just honor our own sunk costs.
We feel a profound psychological compulsion to honor the sunk costs of others.
Yes, the proxy sunk cost. To illustrate this, Olivala ran an experiment that we can call the itchy sweater scenario.
Oh, this one is so relatable. Imagine it's your birthday, and your spouse buys you an incredibly expensive high-end wool sweater. You put it on, and it is excruciatingly itchy.
It is physically uncomfortable to wear.
A rational economic actor would take it off, put it in a drawer, and perhaps donate it. The money is gone either way. Your suffering does not refund the purchase price.
But Olivala found that the vast majority of people will force themselves to wear the itchy sweater. They will endure physical discomfort specifically to justify the financial investment their spouse made.
He ran another variation of this that hits even closer to home, the potluck cake experiment.
Right. You are at a dinner party. You have eaten far too much, you are painfully full, and you couldn't possibly take another bite.
Then, the host brings out a cake. Olivala's team discovered that if the guests are told that the host drove an hour out of their way to a very expensive bakery to procure this specific cake,
The guests will force themselves to eat a slice, despite their physical discomfort.
and the wildest part of the data, it didn't even matter if the person who bought the cake was a close friend or an absolute stranger.
The mere knowledge that someone expended high effort or high cost was enough to override the participants' own internal signals of discomfort. What's fascinating here is the underlying psychology driving both the Minio study and Olivola's experiments.
It's our profound, innate aversion to wastefulness.
Human beings view investments, whether they are financial, temporal, or emotional, as opening mental bank accounts.
So when you invest 10 years into a friendship, you have opened a massive mental account.
We possess a desperate, irrational need to eventually close that account with a positive payout. We want a return on the investment.
Recognizing that you have outgrown a 10-year friendship feels like being forced to close that account at a total catastrophic loss.
It feels like an incomplete transaction. It feels wasteful.
So rather than cutting our losses and allocating our future time to connections that actually serve us, we force ourselves to put on the itchy sweater of that friendship.
We endure the discomfort, hoping that if we just suffer a little longer, the investment will magically yield a return.
But the tragedy is that suffering never changes the fabric of the itchy sweater. Forcing the fit never works.
And this is where the academic theory translates into visceral daily friction. Dr. Debbie Silber, the founder of the PDT Institute, frames this dynamic as the outgrowing crossroads.
You've done the work. You've started walking the bush track. You are eating better. You're managing your emotional reactivity. You're setting boundaries.
But the group of friends you've surrounded yourself with, your tribe, has not. They are still standing on the motorway. They're still engaging in the exact same behaviors they were a decade ago.
The result of that divergence is a profound and incredibly confusing sense of isolation. You are actively taking steps to improve your health and your mindset, which should feel victorious.
Yet in the context of your social circle, it makes you feel excluded. You have become an anomaly in your own tribe.
And Dr. Silber highlights the darkest outcome of this friction: self-sabotage.
To avoid the excruciating discomfort of outgrowing our friends, and to bypass the panic of triggering their insecurities, we actively shrink ourselves.
We will knowingly drink more than we want to. We will eat foods that make us feel terrible. We'll join in on toxic gossip that violates our new values.
Just to maintain our membership in a group that we don't even organically fit into anymore. We choose the little pain of self-betrayal to avoid the bigger pain of social exile.
We shrink ourselves so we don't outgrow the pot. It is a heartbreaking reality. But how do you actually know when you have reached that point of no return?
How do you distinguish between a friendship that is going through a temporary rough patch and a relationship that you have fundamentally outgrown?
Right. Isabella Chase wrote an incredibly insightful piece for The Vessel, where she details the subtle, quiet signs that a friendship has expired.
We often have this dramatic, cinematic expectation that friendships end with explosive arguments or massive betrayals, but the reality is much quieter.
It's usually a slow erosion. Let's look at the 9 signs she identified, because they map perfectly onto the psychological frameworks we've been discussing.
Let's group the first few signs under the banner of the physical and energetic toll.
Chase points out that you start feeling physically drained rather than energized after socializing.
This is a critical metric. Historically, spending an evening with this friend was restorative. It filled your cup. But as your values and neurological pathways diverge, the interaction becomes an exercise in friction.
After a 2-hour dinner, you find yourself needing a full day of isolation just to recover your baseline energy.
Genuine, aligned connection is neurologically nourishing. If a relationship consistently empties your reserves, your nervous system is explicitly signaling a fundamental misalignment.
And that exhaustion naturally leads to what she calls time selectivity. As you embark on personal growth, your relationship with time completely transforms.
You become acutely aware that your time and energy are finite, non-renewable resources. You start fiercely guarding your Saturday mornings or your Sunday evenings.
You find yourself repeatedly choosing the quiet sanctuary of your own solitude over group hangouts that you know will leave you depleted.
The friends you are outgrowing will almost certainly interpret this as a personal rejection. They will assume you are angry or withholding.
But from the inside, it isn't malicious at all. It is simply self-awareness. You are no longer willing to spend your finite energy on interactions that require you to wear the itchy sweater.
Which is why the comparison to new connections becomes so stark.
That's the next sign. You might attend a professional workshop or strike up a conversation with someone at a coffee shop.
And within 20 minutes, you find a flow. They instantly grasp a concept or worldview that you have been unsuccessfully trying to explain to your friend of 10 years for the last 6 months.
It is a jarring experience. It throws the immense, exhausting effort required to maintain the old friendship into very sharp relief.
And it's not about ranking human beings or deciding one person is inherently better than another. It's about recognizing the ease of energetic resonance versus the exhaustion of forced alignment.
That leads perfectly into the second major theme of these signs, which we can call the translation exhaustion and emotional distance.
One of the most painful realizations is when you catch yourself engaging in constant self-editing.
You are sitting across from your oldest friend, and you realize that before you speak, you're running every thought through a complex internal translator.
You are calculating what is safe to share, what might trigger their insecurities, what might sound pretentious.
And what will inevitably create an argument. So instead of sharing your excitement about a new philosophy you are studying, you just nod and ask them about their horrible boss again.
You are curating a highly sanitized, safe version of your reality. You are performing the role of the old you.
And performing is the antithesis of connecting. It creates this profound loneliness where you are completely isolated despite sitting right next to someone.
That self-editing is the direct result of shifting values. And this is a delicate area because it's very easy to slip into judgment.
But shifting values simply means you are now operating from different fundamental frameworks of what makes life meaningful.
This often manifests as quiet, persistent friction over how resources, time, and money are deployed.
Perhaps your growth has led you toward intentional living, quiet reflection, and financial minimalism.
Meanwhile, your friend is still deeply entrenched in using excessive consumption and relentless busyness as primary status symbols.
Every conversation about weekend plans or purchases becomes a subtle referendum on each other's lifestyle. The friction is palpable, even if neither of you ever explicitly addresses it.
And because of that friction, you instinctively start protecting your struggles.
This is one of the most sobering signs for me to read. There comes a distinct moment when you realize that you have completely stopped turning to this friend with your real, substantive problems.
It isn't that you think they don't care about you. It's that their framework for solving problems no longer applies to your life.
If you are dealing with a complex emotional issue and their default response is still the same superficial advice they gave you in your 20s, it feels jarring. It's unhelpful.
So you stop asking, you protect your inner world by walling it off from them, and the relationship gets relegated entirely to surface-level conversations.
You stick to the weather, the latest Netflix documentary, and benign complaints.
You both subconsciously sign a treaty to stay in the shallow end of the pool to avoid the risk of revealing just how far apart your paths have drifted.
That brings us to the final, most internal indicators, the guilt and the relief.
The guilt of wanting space is nearly universal. You receive an invitation to dinner, and your immediate internal response is dread.
You decline, and then you're consumed by guilt.
Yeah.
You feel terrible, because logically you tell yourself that nothing is wrong.
There was no dramatic betrayal. There was no screaming match. Therefore, your desire for distance feels unjustified and cruel.
But as the psychology dictates, that guilt is simply the friction of being caught in the liminal space between the old motorway and the new bush track. It is the growing pains of a shifting identity.
Which is why the final sign is so definitive, feeling relief at the thought of letting go.
If you sit quietly and imagine your life without this person in it, just a natural, drama-free drifting apart where you wish each other well from a distance.
And your primary overwhelming emotion is a deep sigh of relief rather than profound sadness.
You have your answer. When sustaining the bond feels entirely like a heavy obligation and releasing it feels like taking a full breath of air, the relationship has run its course.
The shaman Ruda Iande is quoted in the source material, and his perspective captures the essence of this perfectly. He says, "Most of us don't even know who we truly are. We wear masks so often that our real selves become a distant memory."
Forcing an alignment where none exists, putting on the mask of your past self just to keep the peace and avoid closing the mental bank account, is not an act of kindness to your friend.
You are denying them the opportunity to connect with who you actually are, and it is certainly a profound act of cruelty to yourself.
So we've established the psychological friction, the neurological resistance, and the subtle signs that a friendship is expiring. The logical next question is, what are the actual mechanics of how these relationships end?
How do human beings navigate this dissolution in practice?
Right. This is where the academic framework provided by Vieth, Rothman, and Simpson in their Science Direct paper on adult friendship dissolution becomes incredibly valuable.
They point out that friendships are structurally fundamentally unique when compared to other types of close human bonds.
The researchers emphasize the flexible nature of friendships, And by flexible, they mean there are almost no institutional barriers keeping you in the relationship.
Think about it. If you want to end a marriage, you cannot just stop texting your spouse. There are massive institutional, legal, financial, and often religious barriers.
You have to hire lawyers, divide assets, and make public announcements. If you want to end a relationship with an employer, there are HR departments, notice periods, and the immediate threat of lost income.
But friendships exist purely in the voluntary space. They are not mutually exclusive. There is no legal contract.
There is no HR department to mediate your dispute. Because of this lack of structural friction, you have the absolute freedom to simply walk away.
But paradoxically, that lack of structure often makes the ending much more confusing and difficult to navigate.
Precisely because of this structural flexibility, the researchers identified two distinct divergent routes that adult friendship breakups typically take: the passive route and the active route.
Let's start with the passive route. This is what we colloquially know as the slow fade. You gradually increase the time it takes to return a text.
You become continually too busy to meet up. The physical and emotional distance slowly expands until the relationship simply evaporates.
The research notes that this is the overwhelmingly preferred method for ending relationships with casual friends or acquaintances.
It's driven by physical distance or dwindling social overlap, and it's preferred because it avoids direct confrontation and theoretically leaves the door cracked open for future renewal.
But the passive route is nearly impossible if your lives are deeply intertwined. That is where the active route comes in.
This is the abrupt, unambiguous, definitive end to a friendship.
The active route usually occurs following a specific catalyst. A heated argument, a clear betrayal, or a sudden, glaring realization of entirely diverging values.
This route is much more common with close friends or best friends.
Yeah.
You cannot slow fade a person who is the maid of honor at your wedding and who knows where your spare house key is hidden.
An explicit conversation or an explicit rupture is required.
And the researchers sought to understand the variables that predict which route a friendship will take and when the dissolution will occur. They identified what they call turning points.
These are major external life events that place intense stress on the established context of the relationship.
Moving to a new city, entering a demanding new career, getting married, having a first child.
Or navigating a severe life crisis like a divorce or the death of a parent. These events fundamentally alter your environmental context, your available time, and your emotional needs.
They test the tensile strength of the friendship. I want to dig into the interpersonal factors here because this is where it gets incredibly messy.
The turning point might be the catalyst, but the psychological makeup of the individuals dictates the fallout.
The study highlights how attachment styles completely complicate the dissolution process. Let's look at a hypothetical scenario based on the research. Let's say you've realized you have outgrown a friend.
You're exhausted by the dynamic, and you decide to employ the passive route. You don't want a big fight, so you just start pulling back.
You take 3 days to reply to a text, you give brief answers, you stop initiating plans. If your friend possesses a secure attachment style, they might register the distance, assume you are busy, and naturally match your receding energy.
But if your friend has an anxious attachment style, the passive fade is going to trigger a massive psychological alarm.
They are highly attuned to slight shifts in availability. They will sense that millimeter of distance immediately.
They will likely panic, actively resist the fade, double text you, demand to know what they did wrong, and attempt to force closeness.
Your attempt at a quiet, conflict-free exit will inadvertently generate massive distress and inevitably force an active confrontational breakup.
The inverse is equally complex. Let's say you are dealing with a friend who has an avoidant attachment style.
You decide the friendship is over, and you opt for the active route. You bravely sit them down at a coffee shop, you express your feelings honestly, and you say, I think our paths have diverged, and I don't think we should continue this friendship.
If you are expecting a tearful reconciliation or a deep emotional post-mortem, you will be shocked.
An avoidant individual might simply nod, accept the information, shut down their emotional processing, and walk away with minimal, visible distress.
They possess the psychological architecture to easily compartmentalize the loss and cut ties abruptly.
The mechanism of how a friendship ends and how traumatic that ending is never just about the choice of the person leaving.
It is a highly volatile chemical reaction dependent on the psychological makeup of both individuals involved.
Which leaves us standing in the wreckage. We understand why our brains resist change. We understand why our environments pull us backward.
We know the sunk costs that keep us trapped, the quiet signs that it's over, and the messy mechanics of the breakup itself.
But the most vital question remains. How do we actually move forward? How do we endure the transition from the old life to the new life without turning back when it gets lonely?
Dr. Josh Gressel provides what I think is the most stunning and enduring analogy for this process in his piece for Psychology Today.
He compares the journey of deep personal growth to the biblical story of the Exodus from Egypt.
It's a profound metaphor. In Hebrew, the word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, literally translates to narrowness or straits.
So escaping slavery in Egypt is metaphorically the act of escaping the narrowness of a restricted, unconscious, highly habitual life.
But to achieve freedom, the Israelites couldn't just walk away. They had to cross the Red Sea. They had to step into the terrifying unknown.
And the crucial, terrifying part of that story is what happens immediately after they cross to the other side.
The sea doesn't just stay parted so they can visit on the weekends. The waters violently close back up behind them.
Yes, the pursuing army of their past is washed away, but more importantly, the path back is completely obliterated.
Yeah.
Once you do the deep, harrowing, therapeutic work, once you achieve a genuine shift in consciousness and personal growth.
Returning to your old unconscious life becomes utterly intolerable. You literally cannot fit into the old shape anymore.
Gressel uses a very modern, visceral comparison for this. He likens crossing the Red Sea to driving your car over those severe metal spikes at the exit of a rental car parking lot.
As long as you drive forward, the spikes press down smoothly, you are fine.
But if you panic, put the car in reverse, and try to back up into the lot you just left, those spikes will deploy and absolutely shred your tires, causing massive, irreparable damage.
You cannot unsee the truth about your own psychology, and you cannot unknow the reality of your misaligned relationships.
But because the way back is closed, and the new destination has not yet been reached, you are forced to endure what the Exodus story calls the wandering phase.
The Israelites wandered the desert for 40 years before they found the Promised Land. When you outgrow your old social circle, sever those ties, and haven't yet found the new community that aligns with your new values, you are standing in the desert.
It's a period of immense psychological vulnerability, profound loneliness, and deep disorientation. That desert is where most people quit.
The loneliness becomes so acute that they try to back the car over the spikes.
So to help you survive the desert phase, we need to unpack the practical, actionable tools from our source material. First, how do we overcome that insidious sunk cost fallacy we explored earlier?
How do we convince our brains to stop honoring the investments of the past so we can stop wearing the itchy sweater?
Exactly.
The journal Psychological Science published a study that revealed a surprisingly accessible intervention for this specific cognitive bias. They took subjects who were demonstrably trapped in sunk cost fallacies and had them engage in just 15 minutes of focused mindfulness meditation.
The results were remarkable. That brief period of meditation helped 77% of the participants successfully identify and let go of the sunk cost.
It really is incredible.
I want to pause on that because it sounds almost too simple. How does sitting still for 15 minutes rewrite an ingrained economic fallacy?
It works because the sunk cost fallacy is inherently anchored in the past. It is a fixation on what has already been spent.
Mindfulness meditation forcibly yanks the brain's executive functioning out of the past and anchors it ruthlessly in the present moment.
By focusing on the breath and the immediate physical sensation, the brain stops calculating past losses. When the participants opened their eyes, they were able to evaluate their choices based purely on what would generate value moving forward from the present moment.
Rather than trying to redeem the past, 15 minutes to break a decade of guilt. That is a tool everyone should have in their arsenal.
Absolutely. Another highly practical strategy comes from the Headspace material, and it is specifically designed for dealing with the environmental triggers of going back to your old life.
They recommend literal, physical, verbal rehearsal. Before you go to the family reunion or before you meet up with the old friend who constantly triggers your anxiety, you stand in front of a mirror alone in your house.
And you physically practice saying your new boundaries out loud.
No, I am not going to drink tonight.
I would rather not talk about her behind her back.
I am not willing to discuss my weight with you.
The science behind this is directly tied to the neuroplasticity we discussed earlier. If you only think about your boundaries, the neural pathway remains weak.
But when you physically speak the words, you engage the motor cortex, the vocal cords, and the auditory processing centers of your brain.
You are actively laying down the asphalt for the new bush track. By rehearsing it physically, you ensure that when the environmental pressure is on and the stress trap threatens to push you back to the motorway, Your brain has a newly paved, easily accessible alternative route ready to deploy.
And we can layer that with Charles Duhigg's golden rule of habit change. Duhigg's research insists that you cannot simply extinguish a deeply ingrained habit completely. You can only change it.
The golden rule is this: keep the old cue, keep the old reward, but insert a completely new routine.
If the cue is feeling social anxiety, and the old reward was the feeling of relief and belonging, and your old routine was joining in on toxic gossip, you cannot just delete the routine, you must replace it.
Keep the cue of anxiety, keep the pursuit of the reward of belonging, but change the routine. Instead of gossiping, you call a different, healthier friend. Or you excuse yourself and go for a brisk walk.
And Duhigg emphasizes that belief is the critical mortar that holds this new routine together. This is why finding new communities, whether it's an accountability group, a running club, or a therapy group, is absolutely vital.
You need a social structure that reinforces your belief that the new routine is valid.
And that leads to the final, perhaps most sobering piece of advice, which comes from Dr. Silber at the PBT Institute. Hold firm.
Commit completely to the new path you are carving. Because, like energy inevitably attracts like energy.
If you stay rooted in your growth, if you continue to walk the bush track despite the exhaustion, you will eventually organically attract new people who align with the frequency of who you are now rather than who you were.
But she offers a very strict warning for the desert phase. Do not rush into new relationships before you are fully healed and comfortable in your new identity.
If the isolation of the desert terrifies you and you frantically grab onto new friends just to escape the feeling of loneliness, you will almost certainly recreate the exact same toxic, misaligned dynamics you just fought so hard to escape.
You have to build the tolerance to sit in the empty space for a while. You have to become comfortable with the silence of the desert.
So let's look back at the immense territory we have covered in this deep dive. We started at the microscopic level, exploring the literal hardwiring of our brains. We learned how habits are driven by invisible cravings, how they form massive neurological motorways, and how the biological stress response forcibly detours us off our new healthy paths and back into old patterns to conserve energy.
We unpack the calculus of fear, recognizing that sometimes we cling to a miserable situation not out of stupidity, but because we are terrified that the alternative will expose us to an even greater unmanageable pain.
We examined the overwhelming power of the social trigger, how our environments and old friends activate deep evolutionary survival instincts to adapt and belong at all costs. We looked at the staggering data behind the sunk cost fallacy, realizing that we often trap ourselves in dead relationships simply because we refuse to close the mental bank account at a loss.
We waded through the quiet, painful signs that a friendship has expired. From the physical exhaustion of self-editing, to the friction of shifting values, to the ultimate relief of letting go.
We broke down the academic realities of how friendships passively fade or actively fracture, and how our attachment styles dictate the chaos of the ending. And finally, we confronted the reality that once you cross the Red Sea of personal growth, the spikes are up. You cannot go back to the narrowness.
We learned that protecting your energy and demanding space for your new identity isn't an act of selfishness. It is the literal biological definition of human evolution. And as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your week. It builds on the core premise of everything we have explored today.
Let's hear it.
If James Clear is correct that our environment is the invisible hand that shapes our behavior, and if the neuroscience is correct that our behaviors physically wire our neural pathways, and if our friends are the most immediate, potent environment we possess, then the people you choose to spend your time with are not just your social circle, they are the actual, literal architects of your physical brain structure.
Wow.
So when you find yourself standing in the desert, when you feel that deep, uncomfortable, echoing loneliness during a period of intense personal growth, perhaps you need to reframe it. Perhaps it isn't an absence of love, and it isn't a sign that you have made a terrible mistake. What if that loneliness is simply the necessary physical empty space your brain requires to lay down the tracks for an entirely new future self? Who might you become if you finally stopped fighting the quiet and allowed yourself to just sit in that empty space?
Who might you become? That is the ultimate question. Thank you so much for investing your time and joining us on this deep dive. We hope this exploration provided you with some clarity, some validation, and perhaps a little bit of necessary courage for your own journey through the desert. Stay curious, keep exploring the mechanics of your own life, and we will catch you next time.